Hello and welcome, everyone. We are joined in today's COVID-19 rapid fire video episode by Marc from Alma Consulting and Alma On Demand, one of our favourite experts when it comes to all matters landlord and tenant related. So it's another sunny day in the neighbourhood. We want to know from Marc this morning what's been happening, how are landlords and tenants navigating the challenges of COVID-19? Are the grants working? How are business tenants and their landlords managing to negotiate payment plans? Are sensible arrangements being put in place? What's going on the residential side? Are we seeing aggressive behaviour from landlords? Are we seeing tenants being sensible in the circumstances? So lots of things to unpack in this latest update. Marc, welcome back. It's really nice to have you again with us this morning.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, Melly.
Fantastic. Well, let's dive into our questions. Are you ready to be interrogated?
Yeah, fire away.
He knows what's coming. Brilliant. Well, Marc, let's start with your overall reflections on landlord and tenant relationships over the past 6 weeks. I mean, you've been advising lots of landlords and I assume a number of tenants as well. Great to understand whether there's a difference in what's happening on the commercial side, so with businesses versus on the residential side. What are you seeing?
Well, Melly, commercial sense seems to have prevailed with the relationships that we've been advising on. Landlords in both the commercial and residential sectors have been working with one another to create those workable solutions that we were talking about 6 weeks ago. And those solutions, although temporary, they're helping both parties to overcome the difficulties that we're experiencing. Now, although I haven't experienced this firsthand with our clients, I have also heard of tenants and landlords that have taken a more aggressive stance. So on the tenant side of things, withholding rents, and landlords also being advised to issue statutory demands or seek winding up of corporate tenants. I think, though, that the government, since our last video, has actually temporarily voided the use of statutory demands and winding up petitions, which has obviously been, certainly a relief for tenants. But aside from those chancellor loan schemes, we haven't really seen any more options for landlords at the moment, and they've kind of been left a little bit in the lurch in that respect. But generally speaking, those good working relationships seem to have prevailed.
And are you seeing the same on the residential landlord and tenant side as well, Marc? I know predominantly your practice is very much on the business side of things, but what about residential landlords?
I think, Merly, it's been very similar in the residential sector. Those workable relationships between the landlord and tenant, the ones that have been open and transparent with one another about their difficulties and the arrangements that need to be put in place, the ones that have worked best. The ones where landlords and tenants have shut up shop, just disappointed with non-payments of rents and no discussions have been ongoing, are the ones that will become problematic when the eviction moratorium ends. And those are the ones where really there is total uncertainty as to what's going to happen next in terms of that moratorium and whether the landlord will take an aggressive stance. Similarly, tenants that haven't been paying rent and have taken an aggressive approach there and not liaised with the landlord, getting themselves into undue difficulty. But again, we're just kind of still been banging the drum of just keeping that dialogue open and corresponding with one another, because landlords don't want vacant properties at the moment, and tenants don't want to be booted out when push comes to shove. So having those sensible conversations now really is helping.
I mean, we talked a lot when we came together before about the fact that many tenants, even 6 weeks ago, were having to negotiate payment plans with their landlords. And that's whether you're commercial or residential. Frankly, everybody was having to have some kind of discussion. You mentioned a moment ago that largely what you've seen are sensible payment arrangements being put in place, which I guess is reassuring. We talked previously about no landlord really wanting to go and find new good tenants in this kind of environment. Most people are going to stay put if they are able to do so. What sorts of arrangements are you seeing landlords and tenants put in place? Where have been the points of difficulty with these?
Yes, landlords seem to have prepared themselves well for the June quarter. As you'll appreciate, when the original announcements were made by the government for lockdown, we were fast approaching the March quarter date. It was quite difficult to get those proposals in place by the deadline. Again, opening that dialogue earlier certainly helped, and landlords have, I know certainly with our own clients, have waived March payments, sought to defer them or reduce them. I think that ongoing dialogue has been absolutely crucial, which has enabled the tenant to manage the landlord's expectations as to what rents they can receive. And also the landlords in turn have been able to manage their cash flows on the back of that. Some of our viewers might have seen recently that there have been tenants who have come out and said, look, we've just not been paying the landlord rent. Burger King were quite honest about that, and they had actually suggested recently that a 9-month payment holiday should actually be endorsed by the government in return for a 9-month extension to the end of the lease term. And I think some institutional landlords have actually got behind that, but obviously that's a huge cash flow burden for smaller landlords. I think similarly in the residential sector, there's a kind of nervousness about how long this eviction moratorium is going to last, and how landlords are going to react once these restrictions are lifted and where rent. I know that Labour have been pushing to extend that moratorium for a significant period of time, but the government needs to be seen to be getting that balance right between landlord and tenant relationships. And I think certainly from what we've seen at the moment, it seems to be geared more towards the tenant side of things. But generally speaking, those landlord-tenant relationships that have been open and transparent are the ones that have come up with the workable solutions and seem to be benefiting the most.
Yeah, and I mean, that's our experience too. As you know well, Marc, we work with a lot of the insurers and a lot of the institutions to help look after their business customers, many of whom are landlords, many of whom are tenants of rented premises. And we're definitely seeing the success stories in the dialogues where people have just come together and tried to find common sense solutions. And it often has been delay in payment for a longer lease. We've seen on a couple of occasions as well, people reconfiguring premises or sharing premises, and landlords kind of relaxing rules about subletting or the way that the premises is used. So we've seen changes, for example, in sort of permissions around what people can do in particular premises as well that may have been previously restricted by lease terms, but are being relaxed so that good business tenants can carry on working.
Yeah, that's right. I think those discussions don't necessarily need to centre around rent and payments of rent. I think all those conversations in relation to varying use, as long as local authorities are consulted, reconfiguration of premises, again, those are all going to be important aspects that are going to need to be determined, coming out of this crisis. And to have those conversations now allows businesses to be better prepared.
Yeah. Common sense is the name of the game, and I think you started the session today by underlying and emphasising that, and I think that's what we're seeing too. Marc, can you tell us a little bit more about the Small Business Local Authority grant? So this is a relatively new relief on the scene. I know there are a couple of others that you want to mention to us too. Is it enough, do you think? Is it making a big difference to those renting business premises right now?
Yes, well, there's generally speaking, there's two separate grants that seem to be available at the moment. The first is the small business grant, and if a business is eligible for small business rates relief, then they may also be eligible for the small business grant, and that's an amount of £10,000. It needs to be applied for with your local authority. There's also a separate grant which the government have announced recently, which is the Retail and Hospitality Grant. Now that allows businesses in those sectors, which would include shops, shops and restaurants, cafes, drinking establishments, with a property that has a rateable value of up to £15,000 to receive a grant of £10,000. So that's the same amount as the small business grant. But then also properties that have a rateable value between £15,000 and £51,000, they're able to receive a grant of £25,000. Now, that is in addition to the business rates holiday, which has already been announced and probably discussed at great length. I think really in terms of whether those are enough, the sorts of sums that we're talking about are fairly low in the grand scheme of things. And I think that whilst they would certainly assist some businesses, they're likely to fall short of being the sole solution for many of those businesses. The grants are also taxable, so the benefit is diluted again somewhat. But I think in combination with the rent concessions that could be negotiated, also possibly the eligibility for some of the loan schemes that have been announced, would certainly assist smaller businesses. So it's really about looking at what your options are and trying to conjoin some of those options, to get the maximum benefit for our smaller businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the name of the game for all of us, isn't it? Look at all of your options and go for as many as you believe are viable. Of course, we've got to think about what happens at the end of all of this. I mean, you mentioned the point that these grants are taxable. If we're taking loans, they are a loan. They're not a grant. They will be repayable. So there are consequences of a number of these things that we really do need to understand. I think it's interesting to see the government's recent stance on people renting in co-work environments or some of these smaller sort of market stall type environments as well, where again they're sort of introducing some form of relief to help tenants in those positions. Are you seeing many people take those up?
It's difficult to say at the moment. We haven't had, whilst I've discussed it with clients, whether or not they take it up seems to be a separate matter, and we haven't been involved certainly on the legal side of things, but we've had inquiries in relation to them. So I don't know how well the local authorities have been dealing with those grants or how quickly, probably similar to the banks in that they get an initial flurry of them and they're working their way through. But yeah, I think not too many of our clients have actually been aware of them. Although we have had some inquiries, it tends to be us guiding them as to the fact that they are available and to check your eligibility. But I'm not entirely sure on the figures at the moment.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think if you are like you and I, we're sort of hanging off every word that gets announced, evaluating it, trying to spread the word on things that we believe are relevant to our audience, the message still doesn't necessarily seem to be getting across to the business community or to the landlord community at large, does it? I mean, my next question to you was, what more as sort of business tenants particularly, but also as landlords, could we be doing to help ourselves? And I think perhaps, keeping a sharper eye on what information is coming out, where it is, who we trust, is one of the elements of the answer to that question, isn't it? A lot of people just don't seem to be aware of what is relevant to them.
The government guidance, although it's helpful, it's often quite sort of knee-jerk, and so you'll find that one day a scheme may be announced, but there's no flesh on the bones on that scheme, and actually ensuring you kind of follow that advice and keep checking on the updates, because the government are constantly churning out more and more information. It's important to kind of see whether you're eligible for some of these schemes, to keep checking on the guidance to make sure that actually the guidance hasn't changed, or whether they've been limiting the options or widening the scope. I know, for example, with business interruption loans, there was a huge flurry of people that applied for those originally, and the banks just didn't understand the guidance at first, and they felt that where a business was able to, for example, take a normal commercial loan, that they didn't need to provide that business interruption. And then the government responded by saying, well, no, actually, we want those businesses to be able to take advantage of the government money. And so the guidance changed, and the banks, had more and more applications, and it went from there, really. But I think in terms of what business tenants ought to be doing, it's checking eligibility for the loans, that both the business interruption and the bounce back loans that were recently announced. The government's constantly producing more guidance and relaxing some of the criteria, so I think it's really important to stay on top of those. And again, landlords and tenants, just keeping that dialogue open with regards to, what the future of the premises is going to look like. The alterations that may need to be made to those premises. There's been lots of talk about, access from and to premises and layouts and configuration of those layouts. So check with your landlord whether actually they've got any plans for the building, whether they're looking at reconfiguring anything, and just working together to ensure that when lockdown is actually lifted, that preliminary work has been done and you guys are able to kind of hit the ground running, really, having done all of that pre-work to make sure that it complies with, government guidelines.
And I think that is incredibly important advice. We're going to be operating both as businesses and as individuals in this kind of weird world of, keeping away from other people, managing how we use anything communal, whether that's a reception space, an entrance space, bathrooms, kitchens, canteens. Landlords are going to be grappling with this just as much as employers and business tenants are. So that's great advice, to sort of keep an eye really on the information that's coming out from government. Find the people that you trust, make sure that you're following the advice that they're providing. I mean, our friends at Lighthouse, who deal with a lot of the health and safety information on our site, have got a really laser focus on this right now. So they're producing checklists with us. We're interrogating them mercilessly, as we are you, Marc, as well, about what does all this mean and how does it look if you're having to reconfigure property or reevaluate how that property is used and who you put into it going forward. Marc, if I may, one final question for today's session, and really that's to move from the sort of business tenants to the residential tenants. Obviously, we've had 3-month payment holidays, we've had, restrictions on evictions that the government's imposed, and we're about halfway through a lot of those measures in terms of the time frame, in fact, over halfway, that the government imposed. There was a sort of 3-month moratorium, wasn't there, on sort of landlords taking much more aggressive action that they would do normally were it not for COVID-19. These haven't been the easiest measures for landlords to implement, and it's often at the cost of their own cash flow. They're being left short of funds. They've got their own creditors and their commitments to fulfill. How are residential landlords coping overall, do you know? Have you seen anything inventive or creative in terms of their own abilities to weather this quite hefty financial impact?
Well, I think as you've touched on early, that residential landlords, in the same way as commercial landlords, have been a little shortchanged in terms of the solutions that have been offered by the government, which have largely been directed at tenants themselves, ensuring that everyone has a house to live in, and that's often at the expense of the landlord's cash flow. And it's a fine balancing arrangement that the government are trying to tread at the moment. I think that most landlords have tried to work with their tenants, certainly the ones that we've been working with. They don't want vacant premises, and so they've been working with the tenants to come up with those workable temporary solutions in relation to rent reductions. But ultimately, I think there comes a point where the floodgates will burst, and at the moment we are in the dark as to whether the government are going to extend that eviction moratorium or if the June deadline is going to prevail. What happens next, though, is really anyone's guess. The more aggressive landlords might look to evict tenants as soon as that eviction period is lifted. But the difficulty there is that the notice periods have been extended. But I think certainly from our perspective, hopefully more of the commercially minded landlords will look at each tenant's individual circumstances and the history of that relationship to assess actually, whether they want to continue that ongoing relationship before making any difficult decisions. Obviously, the mortgage payment holidays and business interruption loans have helped to a certain extent, but I think what landlords really want, as everyone else does, is just some clarity as to when lockdown is likely to end, and that unfortunately just isn't black and white at the moment. And hopefully that will allow them to ensure that their tenants can get back to work, start paying the rents, and possibly to recoup some of the rents that have been lost during this difficult period.
Yeah, and of course the other challenge that they're grappling with is they've probably got more people in and on the property at the same time than would be usual. I mean, most people living in their homes won't be there 24/7, or, even 20 hours out of every 7. There is a lot more people congregated in the same space at the same time. And that for them is a challenge too, isn't it? Many of these landlords have lifts by necessity. They're probably having to put in place measures as well to protect tenants when they're coming in and out of the building. Are you seeing many landlords sort of get to grips with the same kinds of issues that employers and business tenants are having to tackle?
Yes, certainly for the future. There's been lots of discussions that have been ongoing about how, an apartment blocks, shared developments are going to function going forwards. And you touched on the right things there, Merle, in terms of lifts and keypads and refuse areas. All of these things, attention's being drawn towards. And I think at the moment it's a little bit early to be implementing those, because it's difficult to get the relevant people on site to be able to implement those kind of changes. But certainly thoughts are being turned towards, the technology that may be available to have, touchless lifts and various different measures that may be put in place to help tenants. But also, this could be the future for kind of shared space living, and it's important that we get to grips with that as soon as possible, really. So I think those conversations are certainly at the preliminary stage, but they've not been enacted yet. I think possibly waiting for some more government guidance as to what's acceptable and what is going to become absolute law, and what's going to become a recommendation.
Yeah, absolutely. And we desperately need that guidance. I was talking to a landlord of some student properties the other day. So obviously the students at the moment have all gone home, so the property is broadly empty. But the kinds of considerations that he was thinking about, students tend to like to congregate. They have communal spaces within the rented building where they can get around the coffee machine. They can work downstairs in a kind of communal workspace. All of these considerations about what happens when the building actually gets back into normal action, how they keep people safe in those environments, whether they need to reconfigure furniture, whether they need to decommission coffee machines, encourage people not to congregate. All of that, I know he's working through. I know you're working through those kinds of things with your clients too. We really do need that kind of guidance, whether it's a rule, whether it's a principle. I think we will need to know a lot more detail about what the world looks like going forward and how we can prepare for that. So on that note, Marc, thank you very much for allowing us to interrupt your day and interrogate you yet again. It would be fantastic to come back again in a few weeks' time and see how people are grappling with some of these issues, what kind of guidance we have got, what it means, and what we can learn from each other, I think, during the next few weeks that we can once again share with this community. So thank you again very much for sharing what you're seeing, what you're advising, and what you're reflecting on with your clients right now.
Thanks for having me, Merle.
Okay, folks, well, that is all for today's session. If you do have questions, whether you're a landlord or a tenant, about what is being experienced right now, Alma are fantastic experts. Please don't struggle alone. Please don't wonder or worry about what the answers are. If you can get in touch with us, we can get in touch with them, and we can all help you get the answers and the solutions that you need. Until then, be safe, stay safe, keep going. As we get more information, we will be passing it on and updating all of these blogs so that we can keep you as up to date and as confident and assured about what the position is as we can be. And we'll see you again very soon.